Tipping points in salt marshes. The scramble for high land. Hello everybody. I'm Perry Coleman and my company is Delta Environmental Consulting, a small South Australian consulting business based just north of Adelaide, with over 4 decades of experience in saltfield, salt marsh and salt lake ecology, botany and biology. Faith Coleman from EcoProTem is also South Australian based in the southeast at Tintinara. Faith has specialist skills in spatial analysis and in working in the environment, community and government interface. Recently, Natural Resources Adelaide and Mount Lofty Ranges had reports of ill health in a species of samphire known to provide habitat for the endangered samphire thornbill, and they requested that we investigate. Today's presentation has come out of that work. If you want a blow-by-blow account of the significant loss of the shrubby samphire Tecticornia arbuscula from our coastal salt marshes, I really recommend grabbing a copy of the report. The summary of the depressing news is that in a tiny space of time, less than a handful of years, nearly 70% of the species has been lost from the River Light Delta. Things are not so dire in other locations, however the losses elsewhere are significant. After we recovered from the shock of our visit to the Delta, we went looking seriously. We scoured the eastern shores of Gulf St Vincent, trudged the arid salt marshes in the uplifted ends of Spencer Gulf at Port Augusta, kayaked long reaches of the Coorong, slogged around the York Peninsula and camped on the shores at Avalon in Victoria. In all those areas, the shrubby samphire is dying. And worse, in many cases it is not retreating further inland. In the face of rapid changes in sea level, shrubby samphire looks to be losing its place as a major landscape feature plant, and it may become relegated to tiny footholds as a minor species. And the fate of the samphire thornbill? Well, that's a good question. So how bad is the loss of shrubby samphire? It varies, basically geomorphologically. Long, flat, extensive areas of delta habitat seem to be most impacted. Places with considerable topographic variation are less impacted. Places with a good source of sediment seem to be less impacted, and places with restricted tidal exchange also seem to be less impacted. Some illustrations from the different locations we visited follow, but the loss of shrubby samphire is not really the focus of this talk. The focus is on illustrating what little we know about how different species in the salt marsh may respond to sea level rise, and how that confounds our understanding of how this habitat as a whole may look in the future after sea level rise. I will be flicking through the next few illustrations fairly quickly. One thing to note is how difficult it can be to even notice that a particular species is not doing well in a very green-looking environment that has many similar-looking plant species, where only a few species are immediately struggling. Aerially, the losses may not be apparent either, as other species of samphire rapidly fill the niche left by the dead shrubby samphires, even while the skeletons are still present, or as the shrubs are dying back. Tall, shrubby samphires grow directly behind the mangroves. These tall plants occur in a narrow ribbon, and the losses can be overlooked, particularly if using aerial imagery to assess salt marsh health. The photograph to the left is north of Middle Beach in the southern Light River Delta, with in excess of 70% dead. In fact, some areas are approaching 100% loss. The photograph on the top right is south of Middle Beach in the Salt Creek Delta, another area in excess of 70% dead. And the bottom right is Wills Creek on the York Peninsula, over 20% dead even in the northwest area of the Gulf, where until recently the hypersalinity-based carbonate sedimentation that occurs at the top ends of the Gulfs, probably combined with geostatic rebound, was allowing salt marsh and mangroves to prograde seaward. These photos are typical of how loss presents, where shrubby samphire is found in this location directly behind the mangroves, exposed to unrestricted tidal inundation. Losses of shrubby samphire are also significant on extensive flats. The photograph on the top left is at Torrens Island, it's quadrant 13. Torrens Island's in the Barker Inlet, which has subsidence combined with over 10 centimetres of sea level rise since the early 1990s, which leads to an accumulated relative sea level rise of about 15 centimetres. Most of the shrubby samphire at Torrens Island is gone and has been completely replaced with glasswort. At the bottom left, Clinton, which is in northwest Gulf St Vincent, where losses are apparent even in an accreting area. Sedimentation is not keeping pace with sea level rise in this area, and once an area has this kind of loss, it is only a handful of years until the whole population crashes. The photograph on the right is at the River Light Delta. The background dead strip is hundreds of metres wide and kilometres long in extent, and it's all dead shrubby samphire. In the foreground, the species that seem to be better able to tolerate extra inundation may be preventing landward migration of the samphire. With such flat topography, losses in these areas are very extensive when they occur. Embankments and cheniers are an entirely different situation. The top photograph is at Avalon in Victoria, which displays healthy old plants growing on a small sand berm in the gardens of the homes there. The bottom left shows tall shrubby samphire at Port Gawler continuing to grow in soil placed over its roots during recent road repairs, and at the bottom right, a dead specimen next to a myoporum in an adjacent area. Some niches that shrubby samphire occupies are currently not as badly impacted by sea level rise, or are in areas where there are adaptive possibilities. The opportunity to push roots uphill on embankments into better drained conditions, or into soil washed down the bank around the plants, allows some plants to adapt. Plants growing on well-drained sand ridges seem to be able to cope better as well, but these geomorphologies are a very small portion of the salt marsh landscape. Some areas of salt marshes have had their tides restricted, either naturally in estuarine areas or because of the placement of roads and embankments. The photograph on the left-hand side shows mixed health of tall shrubby samphires in drains that get tidal inundation at Avalon in Victoria. At the top right, we also have mixed health of low-growing shrubby samphire in the Sabca areas at Thompson's Beach in Upper Gulf St Vincent. In the middle right, we see about 20 to 50% losses are common in the Coorong in the area around Parnka Point and the northern part of the Southern Lagoon. The southern part of the Southern Lagoon does not have much shrubby samphire growing adjacent to the waters there because it's hypersaline. The photograph at the bottom right shows saline and brackish wetlands beyond the southern extent of the Coorong, Cortina wetland and Kantara lakes, for example, which have relatively healthy populations of shrubby samphire growing as an understory and fringe to the melaleucas. While these are not impacted immediately by sea level rise, there may be groundwater changes as a result of sea level rise that could impact them in the future. While the geomorphology of salt marshes is generally low-lying, relatively flat areas subject to tidal inundation, the previous sections highlight how the presence of embankments, cheniers, dunes, differences in soil types can affect drainage and the tidally restrictive landforms can alter the impact of sea level rise on any specific marsh area. And salt marshes comprise many different species. Despite the multitudinous bathtub models you may have seen, such as this old one of ours that I've used here as an illustration, the vegetation associations in salt marshes do not appear to be simply moving inland in an orderly manner and relocating themselves in a similar pattern further up the slope. Some species are disappearing. Other species seem able to cope with increased inundation where they are. Still others can migrate faster than others to obtain the best locations. It's a scramble for the high land. This is a reflection of the speed with which sea level rise is occurring. Looking at the table in the slide, you can see that most salt marsh plant communities are now existing well outside their preferred inundation regime and would need to migrate inland across several vegetation associations to reach land where the inundation would be more appropriate for them. So is there any way to predict which species will be able to cope with sea level rise and what future salt marshes may look like? The next few slides are really the crux of this presentation. They illustrate the adaptation strategies of just 4 species that occur right in the action as far as sea level rise goes. These are species that are closest to the sea and that have seen changes in the daily pattern of tidal inundation already. Note, however, that there are other species further uphill that are also struggling. Not because of changes in daily inundation, but because the wetter soil downslope is creating hydrological or salinity changes in the upslope soils as well. The sea heaths, for example, in the upper marsh are starting to disappear. So we cannot think that we can just focus on the plant species lowest down the slope. While we are looking downhill, there may be species disappearing behind us, uphill. And note also that similar understandings of how plant species may adapt are required for other habitats that will be affected by other climate change. Rainfall, frost frequency, wind exposure, evaporation, solar insolation. Our ability to predict the impact of these changes on our natural ecosystems is remarkably low. And now that the changes are upon us, we may well only find out the next impacts after they start to occur. So the white mangrove that grows in South Australia is Avicennia marina. Sediment accumulation and expansion of the root mass both allow existing trees to migrate upward while staying in place. However, in the face of sea level rise that is more excessive, the trees put energy into ensuring a new generation can adapt. The young trees, before they have new metaphors, can adapt to inundation regimes varying from every few days to permanently inundated. A continuum of gas space in their stems allows the trees to evaluate the inundation regime, and then they grow their new metaphors to an appropriate length to deal with that pattern. Long new metaphors are seen in deeper waters, shorter new metaphors in less frequently wet areas. Once the new metaphors are grown, however, the tree is less able to tolerate changes in the inundation regime. So adult trees in areas which are becoming too wet send cable roots uphill. They may get some extra oxygen themselves, allowing them to survive longer, but they also make a new nursery area for young trees by putting up new metaphors to trap the propagules, and also by releasing a chemical that deters other plants. You can often see a narrow band of clear mud landward of mangroves that are trying to migrate inland. The mangrove seeds are actually propagules, fully formed little plants. This allows the fallen propagules to rapidly establish when they land in the new nursery area. So, is Avicennia's approach successful? Well, yes, apparently. The illustration is derived from aerial photos of the mouth of the River Light, north of Adelaide. Each photo shows the same area. They're about 3 kilometres across. On the left, you can see a mud bank, khaki coloured, which made the delta into the classic deltaic bulge shape. This occurred after European catchment clearance. A lot of mud came down the river. The dark green mangrove band marks the original coastline, and you can see that there are chenia ridges coloured light yellow behind the mangrove band. In the middle diagram, you can see that the mangroves have colonised the mud bank until sediment supply ran out. On the right-hand side, which is the most recent picture, the mangroves have started to move inland as sea level rise starts to bite. Chenia ridges were surrounded, then actually started to wash away. The central chenias are gone now, and chenias only remain near the northern and southern edges of the delta. Note the increasingly saturated soils which are causing the formation of dendritic creek lines. The next species that we'll look at is the bearded glasswort. The species reproduces vegetatively, we call this clonally, as well as with seed. Clonal reproduction allows individual plants to migrate upward in place by growing on top of themselves, as well as migrating landward via rooting runners. The runners are able to obtain resources like oxygen and send them back to parts of the plants growing in less ideal circumstances. So how effective is this approach? The St Kilda embankment was built between St Kilda and Dry Creek in the 1890s. The salt marsh that was stranded behind the seawall acidified, and the surface level lowered by about 70 centimetres before the ICI salt field was built a little inland in the 1930s. Once the salt field was built, the old seawall was breached and the sea re-entered the subsided land. Studies of the Sarcocornia salt marsh there revealed that although it looks the same on the surface as nearby Sarcocornia marshes that have never been stranded, the soil is very different. Unsubsided marshes have sandy loam underlying the plants, which you can see in the diagram at the bottom. The subsided marsh, which is the diagram at the top, comprises a 70 centimetre thick layer of peaty material made up of decayed plant matter. Essentially, it's the earlier versions of the surface Sarcocornia plants that are still growing there. The moisture content and salinity of this peaty layer is higher than the soil underlying unsubsided marshes, and the pH is lower. More recently, our studies at the River Light showed that Sarcocornia has already moved inland, outflanking the shrubby samphire, growing over the bands of brookweed, Samolus, and hemicroa, and it's now found in the high marsh amongst the blue bushes. So this suggests that this is the species which is responsible for the illusion of health being projected by the salt marshes as it's very lush, and it's clearly being successful moving inland as well as being able to adapt in place. This is the third species that we're going to look at, Tecticornia halocnemoides, the grey samphire, and it's generally found in arid and hypersaline conditions. Individuals growing on sabkas need to tolerate years of dryness, followed by weeks of inundation when the sabkas flood. The plants often grow as almost monospecific stands, low growing but close together, making a dense canopy that it is difficult for other plants to gain a foothold through. The gnarled, woody forms suggest these plants are not the type that die when conditions are bad and that recolonise when they're good. Most of the stands have been present for a very long time through quite extreme decadal weather cycles. The grey samphire has very long flower stalks and produces many hundreds of seeds on each spike. The seeds are contained in the remains of the flower, which are like little paper bags and act as a parachute to carry the seed in the autumn breezes so that the seeds are widely distributed across the marsh. This plant is currently occupying the high ground behind the shrubby samphires in many locations, and is probably the plant that is preventing them from colonising landward. Whether this species can remain competitive in the face of Sarcocornia transgression, though, is not known. Which brings us to our shrubby samphires, Tecticornia arbuscula. Clearly these plants are long-lived, and the older stands were established during a period of relatively stable inundation regimes. The plants only produce a few seeds per spike, commonly 2 to 4, and the single seeds stay buried in the wood until the branch breaks in a storm and the bits are washed by the high tide to a new location. If that location is already occupied, then the seed may be wasted. As the plants are not at all tolerant of hypersalinity, if the tide takes the seed too far upslope, the plants will not grow either. If the seeds manage to be tossed up higher than the regular tide onto land that is well leached by rainfall, they may grow if there is a space. High and dry plants, such as those on the embankments at Port Augusta or on the dune at Avalon or at Cortina wetlands south of the Coorong, simply drop their broken branches where the plants occur, and speculatively their seed may not spread as quickly as tidally mediated seed. As far as adaptive strategies go, the shrubby samphire appears to be somewhat behind the 8 ball. In summary, our salt marshes are showing the signs of having reached a tipping point, with sudden changes in the abundance of some species already being recorded. Flow-on effects are likely. The magnitude of the impacts on the endangered samphire thornbill is not yet known, for example. There are likely to be unpredictable adaptation outcomes in salt marshes as a result of sea level rise, and understandings around the adaptation at the species level needs to be developed if we are to have any predictive ability at all. Thank you for listening today. If you are interested, there are many more details about shrubby samphire loss, samphire thornbill distribution and ecology, and recommendations for management actions to maintain or improve the habitat values of samphire communities under threat in our report. To get the report, please visit the website that is listed here and look for Thornbills, Samphires and Saltmarsh Tipping Points 2017 report.